Support for your public radio station comes from our members and from Bob Johnson Auto Group, proud supporter of Connections with Evan Dawson. Believing an informed public makes for a stronger community. BobJohnsonAutoGroup.com.
For WXXI, this is Connections. Filling in for Evan Dawson, I'm Gino Finelli. Today's connection was made on May 20th when the United States Senate passed the No Tax on Tips Act. The bill, now in front of the House, would create a new tax deduction of up to $25,000 specifically for cash tips received by employees in their course of work. The bill was introduced by Texas Senator Ted Cruz with bipartisan co-sponsor support and passed somewhat unexpectedly. As NBC News reported, the bill was put out for unanimous consent by the Democratic Nevada Senator Jackie Rosen, meaning any single senator could block it. None did, and the bill went through. The concept of no tax on tips was a common refrain of President Donald Trump on the campaign trail and was also supported by his opponent, Kamala Harris. Proponents say it's a boon to working-class service workers and puts more money in the pocket of everyday Americans. But critics argue the true benefit will only be felt by the highest earners, with diminishing returns for the poorest Americans. So to talk to us about it, I'm joined by Kent Gardner, economist. Kent, thanks for being here.
Hi, Gina. Yep.
Maria Stoyanova Montoya, a bartender and English teacher. Did I get that right?
Stoyanova. Thank you for having me.
I tried to practice beforehand. I still messed it up.
No worries.
Casey Moore is organizing director of Workers United of Upstate New York. Casey, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
And Melissa Fleischut is president of the New York State Restaurant Association. Melissa, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So I kind of wanted to lay out the groundworks of what this proposal means and what it will do. So kind of wanted to have you kind of speak to that a bit of what you see as the economic effect of a bill like this, what its intent is, and what you expect its actual outcome to be.
Well, that's a complicated question,
yes.
Gino. Sorry that I had to start with that disclaimer. The notion of reducing the burden of the public sector on people of lower income is not new. We've been doing that for a long time. Our whole tax system is a progressive tax system, so that if you're a relatively low income, the share of your income that you pay in tax is lower, and so that is a time-honored principle, and we see that in terms of the standard deduction. We see that in terms of the tax tables themselves, and lots of other things that benefit people who are of low income. So I think the reflex here is to say, gee, we've got this class of individuals who aren't paid a lot, and why don't we help them out by getting rid of the tax that they're paying on their income? But I think the question that this poses, and before you try to kind of trace through first the summary on the total economic impact is it's really low, because for two reasons. First, that people who are tipped workers generally don't have high income anyway, and if you're say you're an individual, your standard deduction is $15,000. You have to make more than $15,000 to have to pay income tax at all. And full time at New York State's minimum wage brings you $16,700, something like that. If you're head of household, the standard deduction is more like $22,000. So it's estimated that only 37% of individuals will actually be affected by this. So the economic impact, just because the class of people for whom the income tax actually bites, who are tipped workers, the economic impact is really going to be small. But the question I just want to put on the table is, why tipped workers? Why not home health aides? Why not social workers? Why not custodians? What is it about tipped workers that makes them more deserving of elimination of income tax than other people who are generally in the same income class?
Maria, you work in a tip industry. Do you think this is the kind of thing that would massively benefit you in the long run?
Not in the long run. And I think in the short run, for sure, I would have some more money in my pocket weekly, but it's not going to help with the cost of anything in the long run, such as healthcare, for example, or childcare. And I would use it, I guess, to stimulate the economy by paying my student loans and not necessarily spending or investing. I think with more income, there has to be more financial literacy and responsibility and awareness and how to sort of invest that income. But I really like, Kent, your question, or the topic that you pose is why tipped employees. And I think the issue is more how we value certain bodies of labor, and something that I've struggled with as a bartender, because it is my craft, it's my art, and it's very much what I am able to support a family of four on, is my work as a bartender. It's a real job. And I think sometimes when we looked at tipped employees in labor, the labor itself isn't valued as much as a paycheck or a salary job. And maybe that's why we're sort of approaching this population and hoping to kind of generate more voters or generate more spending on that sort of ground level. But I don't think that it's going to have lasting effects that are really going to help put me in a better economic situation.
So, Casey, Workers United represents a good amount of tipped service workers, and I think most notable is Starbucks Workers United is under the Workers United umbrella. Do you see this as something that is overall beneficial to the workers, that this is kind of meeting some kind of need that has previously gone unmet and will, as it's been put up by the proponents, put a lot of money back into the pockets of regular working Americans? Do you think it would accomplish that goal, and is the most efficient way to do so?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I agree with the speaker right before me that I think in the immediate, it would be great. We're always going to advocate for our members to have more money in their pockets, especially as there's rising costs of livings and all of this. But I ultimately agree that I think this policy is it falls in line with a lot of what the Trump administration likes to do, which is take something that's not ultimately going to solve the root of the problem and do something flashy that sounds great, but that does not address the root of the problem. I think, if you look at the other things that are going on at the federal level right now, Trump's big, beautiful bill, you're going to cut Medicaid and Medicare. And a lot of the tipped service workers that we represent rely on that for healthcare. And so you're going to it's the exact thing that we talk about in a union organizing campaign, where companies will often do this. They'll give with one hand and take with the other. And this is exactly what the federal government is trying to do. And the thing that they're taking away is much more impactful than a few $100s, potentially zero for some people. And I think the other thing that we need to look at is that it shifts responsibility away from the employer, which is a huge thing there. I know companies like DoorDash and Uber are lobbying and advocating for their workers to fall under this policy. But what that does is removes the responsibility from them to pay a living wage to their employees, and instead says, well, you have a tax break, so you don't need a wage increase. You have the federal government taking care of that, which is, again, welfare for these big billion-dollar companies like Starbucks, where I was a worker, but it doesn't address the root inequality of what we're seeing going on in this country right now.
I think you're absolutely right too. And if I may,
go ahead.
I've again been working in a tipped industry since I was 14, and I've often heard, well, you don't pay taxes on your tips anyways, even without people having the actual knowledge of that, and the burden of paying me is on my guest, right? And if they assume that I don't have to pay taxes, they'll probably tip me less. And they don't understand that tip goes to more than just me. Oftentimes, tips are allocated to different people within the restaurant. You have your host and your dishwashers and all levels that make that cocktail delicious for you, right? And I don't get all of that. It goes to my teammates, and the less people are tipping, the less money I get. And then when you're talking about the burden of responsibility, and we're looking at the minimum wage for tipped employees, it's significantly less than non-tipped, right? And the American people are left to pay us. They're responsible for paying me. And that's according to their whim, right? If they think that I'm good enough, they'll leave me more money. But I can be better for someone that has the ability to pay me more, and they might not necessarily do that.
Yeah, and I this was the conversation we were having in the newsroom before this show, was that this is a very American system. Like this is
definitely
not the way most of the world works. That a gratuity, a tip, is usually put onto given to a service when you like the service a lot and you want to show appreciation for it. it's not considered a supplement to the wages that the employer doesn't actually want to pay, or doesn't have the ability to pay. It could be one or the other. But Melissa, I want to turn to you on this a little bit. This is just a fact of reality that tipped service workers are often paid less directly from their employer. The expectation is that gratuity and tips kind of make up the gap and allow you to make a living in that industry. Does removing the taxes...
It's not just an expectation, it's a reality.
It's a reality, yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
And do you think that taking taxes off of tips, and again, to specify, it's cash tips only that this bill would apply to, does that level the playing field of the wage gap that does exist at the core here? That there is a wage gap that exists for service workers. They are paid at a lower level, and does this help them ultimately to make more money and put more money in their pocket?
Yeah, happy to clarify a couple points
Sure.
here from our standpoint. So from the New York State Restaurant Association standpoint or the National Restaurant Association standpoint, this was not something that we were actively seeking or advocating for from either presidential campaign or camp at the time. And when they came up with the idea, I mean, we want to support our employees, and this proposal came forward. So it was and is supported by the National Restaurant Association. But this concept, first of all, let's clarify, in New York State, you cannot share tips with back-of-the-house employees. So line cooks, dishwashers, folks like that can't be included in a tip pool or a tip sharing situation in the restaurant. But you do share typically in the front of the house where you deal with the hostess, the bartender, the service staff. So that's all true as well. So it's not just the individual receiving the tip. State law requires any time that you do not receive full minimum wage based on the cash wage from your employer plus your tips, that we make up the difference and pay full minimum wage. But from our data and our statistics, Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics is showing New York data has an hourly mean wage for waiters and waitresses of $24.54 an hour and $51,000 annual mean wage. So I would agree with the rest of your speakers that, this might not have a huge impact, but we are concerned about what is the message this sends to our kitchen staff, who are just as valuable team members to the entire restaurant family and need to also be recognized for the hard work that they're doing.
So I want to ask something, and for the people that are directly involved in this industry, during the campaign season last year, this was a constant talking point. It was targeted ads on social media I saw constantly of vote this way because mostly it was vote for Trump because no tax on tips. I saw this dozens, if not hundreds of times during the campaign season. Was this something that people in the industry were really clamoring for before the campaign, or did this just kind of... Just from your experience, did you see anything like that? Maria, I'll turn to you.
Sure. Personally, this is not the topic that I am concerned about, that my colleagues and friends in the industry talk about. That's not the most important thing for us. We want healthcare. And I know I've worked in restaurants where healthcare was available and 401ks, and that's wonderful. And there are restaurant groups in Rochester that offer that, and that's terrific. But again, the taxes on especially cash tips, we're moving more and more to a cashless society. I don't make a lot of cash tips, to be frank. Most of my tips come in credit card form. It just isn't a big deal for us. That's not the forefront. That's not what's on our...
I'm sorry to interrupt.
That's okay.
The definition under the legislation does include...
Okay, that's what I thought.
It's very strange. The definition of cash tip includes credit card. I know that's very odd to say,
right,
but it's wonky legislation.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah,
I was pretty sure that was true as well. I
got confused when you mentioned
and the cash piece of this. I mean, it's still probably true that in many establishments the cash tips are not wholly reported. So. That's another little wrinkle in this. The other thing that's interesting is that I think that the notion that in New York State, restaurant owners are obligated to level up to the minimum wage. That's not, and we have a much higher minimum wage than the rest of the country. So if you go to a different state where you don't have that leveling up provision and you're still at $7.15 an hour, the tips are probably a much larger, voluntary tips are probably a much larger portion of a tipped worker's salary than they would be here in New York State.
So, Casey, too, I wanted to touch on this point to you of the workers that Workers United represents. Was this a hot topic of conversation over the past couple of years that led up to, this being a campaign topic? Was this something people they were really demanding and hungry for over the past years that you've seen?
That's a great question. And I work with a wide range of workers, from restaurants to grocery to larger chains like Starbucks and baristas. And I can't say that it has been something that I've heard before. I think, the work that I deal with, we're directly bargaining with the employers. So that might be a part of it. But a lot of the conversations are around, tip guarantees from the employer. So if, we're not getting a certain amount of tips from the customer, can the employer basically fill that gap? But I think the things that I've been seeing from workers and, my own experience as a Starbucks barista is kind of the point I made before, where the concern is more about how am I going to afford housing? How am I going to afford healthcare? And what benefits do we even have access to in the service industry? So from my experience, that's where the conversation has been more around, and the idea of tax on tips. While I know there's some unions, I believe it was in Nevada, there was a large union that came out in favor of this during the last presidential election. It's not a huge conversation, to Maria's point, that I've been a part of.
So the puzzle, if I can, Gina, the puzzle here is that, this Ipsos poll said that 75% of Americans roughly were supportive of the notion of having no tax on tips. And yet what I'm hearing from the other people on the show today that, it's not really a big deal. And economists universally have said, no, it's not really a big deal. So I think what we're up against here is a great campaign throwaway line. And it's been one of my challenges with looking at economic policy coming out of this administration is it doesn't seem to come out of a considered assessment of positions. I mean, once again, why tipped workers? Why not other workers? This became a throwaway line for the campaign. I don't think it has made a big difference to the campaign. I mean, and of course, Harris immediately adopted it as well and said, your perception, Gino, is that this was a Trump initiative. Well, it was probably Trump first, but then Harris jumped on board. So anyway, I think we're caught up in the craziness of our current political moment.
I mean, it's hard not to be.
Well, and if oh, sorry, could I just add another
No, go ahead.
Yeah, and I actually agree with what Melissa was saying is about, why some tipped workers, and we're not even clear about what industries those would be. They said that they would come out with a list of, industries that have typical tips. Like, what does that even mean? And so my other thought is that, of course, that creates divide in the workplace. So instead of being frustrated about, the federal government potentially limiting the amount of people who can access Medicaid, you're going to be mad at your coworkers instead, because why does the front of house staff not have taxes on their tips? And now we're paying full tax, even though we make same amounts. And maybe I know a lot of restaurants where the back of house actually makes a lot less than the front of house because they don't have access to the tips. So I think it creates an environment that is not productive either.
Yeah, and I think that, from the consumer side of things, it is a real reality that, especially I think since COVID, I think this has been happening before then, but since the pandemic era, we have seen the proliferation of tipping beyond where you traditionally expect to see it. I mean, go through your day-to-day life and you will probably be asked to leave a tip about 3 times throughout your day. That would be my guess.
It's the tip jar that has become ubiquitous, right?
Yeah, the tip jar, the tablet screen. Virtually everywhere you go. I went with one of my friends to get ice cream last night, and I went through a drive-thru, and I was asked to leave a tip at the drive-thru, which I've never experienced before. It's odd. I don't think anyone has a problem with the idea of supporting the workers themselves, but has it come to a point where this has been a way of subsidizing often low-level workers that the employers themselves are not paying for? They are not paying living wages, and then it's being pushed off to the consumers themselves. I pulled this week there was a financial publisher Bankrate that did a survey that found that nearly half Americans, I believe about 46%, viewed tipping culture as, quote, out of control, was the phrasing that they used. So two parts to this, and I want to lay it out to the table of the thoughts on it. One, what is the core issue here that we are seeing such a proliferation of tipping being integrated in our day-to-day life? And what is the core issue that we could solve here? What could actually be done beyond just removing taxes on tips that would actually help the workers themselves? As a worker themselves, Maria, I would want to turn to you first of some of your thoughts on that.
I think it comes down to how, again, we value different labor systems. And why is my work in a restaurant seen as not worthy of a livable federal and state wage, right? And why is our practice to fill in that gap with gratuity? And if you do look at restaurant workers in other countries, they are paid a more livable wage, and tips are optional to show gratitude for that extra level of service. So I'm not the economist, so I don't have a solution for that, but I do think it's important to pay livable wages to all types of labor. And how do we decide? Again, we were talking about the front of the house and the back of the house versus delivery drivers versus drive-through clerks. Like, how do we decide what labor is more important and deserves a higher wage? Is that a fair question? I can't solve that in this moment, but the way we structure our livable wages in this country and looking at housing and healthcare access is important to consider in all of that.
Ken, I want to turn to you a little bit. I mean, is this sustainable, the way that things have been?
Of course
framed
it's
right now?
sustainable.
Yeah.
It's been sustainable for how many generations now?
Sure.
This isn't new. It is a culture that's unique to the United States, and it is wildly inequitable. I don't think there's any question about that. I mean, I had a period where I was also working in a nice restaurant. At least as long as we kept the lights down, it was a very elegant-looking place. If you turned up the lights, the cigarette burns and the faded curtains and all that. But we did. But it was a fun place to work. I was, I was making, cooking at the table. I made steak Diane, flaming cherries Jubilee. I mean, it was really a lot of fun.
You're dating yourself with those references.
Well, yeah.
I am indeed, but it was fun while it lasted. And,
Sure.
yeah, it was. I shouldn't tell you how many years. A long time ago. But enough exposure to that to understand again just how inequitable the tipping business is. So if you're, the tip is a proportion of the of the final bill. If you are fortunate to be serving tables in a place where the average entree is $50, you make a lot more money than if you're serving in a place where the average entree is $15. And the difference in the work is frankly not all that significant. So I think that there's and I think it's also clear that there's a certain amount, there's a fair bit of showmanship involved in extracting better tips. No surprise that probably attractive young women get better tips than the frumpy 50-year-old who actually knows the menu a little bit better. And there's all sorts of ways in which the system is a mess. And I have no suggestion on how to fix it. Again, it's deeply embedded in the culture, and as you say, Gino, this particular practice is moving into places where it didn't used to be the case. Tipping into, I mean, for heaven's sake, the ice cream parlor, the drive-up ice cream.
Yeah,
Is,
they put that tablet in my face and asked 18, 20, or 25%. Like, really? You reached out a window. And this isn't about not supporting the workers themselves. I'm always going to tip. begrudgingly sometimes when I don't think that it's a certain service that is supposed to have a tip.
That points out that the ostensible reason for tipping, which is that we're going to tip for better service and not tip for worse service. Many of us, I think, feel the same way you do. Well, this is kind of something I really just need to do. Yeah, the guy was kind of grumpy, but he's depending on this. So it's just the system is just broken in so many different ways.
I think also the level of service and expectations of our service staff has changed too. I study our food menu. I spend a lot of time crafting cocktails and working with the back of the house to make sure my ingredients complement their ingredients. And I'm lucky to be cross-trained and I can work different areas in a restaurant. And we spend time learning about our wine list and the wine producers and their vineyards and we serve all natural wine. So we learn about that process too. And there are different certification programs that these tipped employees spend time and money to further themselves in these careers too.
Well, my only point is not all of them, and again, I don't think that the wage system, the person who walks in off the street doesn't know that about
right,
you.
Exactly. They don't know that about us, and I think that's part of why I was eager to come on the show today, is to kind of share that. Like I'm also a high school English teacher, and I do a lot of prep that happens before I enter the classroom, and I talk about Macbeth. I do a lot of prep before I enter the bar and talk about my swizzle, right? And there's a lot of research that we do for that too. So our time isn't just necessarily that 35 seconds that I hand you your ice cream cone, right? And I don't want to diminish that drive-through worker, but we do put time in behind the scenes, just as you put time in to research these questions that you're asking us today. Should I tip you for asking such a poignant question, right? Or
I wouldn't say no.
Perfect. Put it on my tab.
I can also say that, working as a Starbucks barista for almost 2 years, and I've had a variety of jobs in the service industry before I became a full-time union organizer, but working at Starbucks was the hardest job that I think I've ever had in my life. I mean, there's a certain person a lot of times that goes to Starbucks. So like when you're a new employee, and somebody's shouting, venti iced mocha with 2 shots of blonde espresso and 2 shots of vanilla and this and that. And, it takes, it is a skill, it takes a long time to learn. It took me about 6 months to be able to make the drinks as fast as they wanted us to go, because it really is a factory line working at a place like Starbucks, where you're in a position for, 3 to 4 hours. I got carpal tunnel from working at Starbucks from, the speed that they expected us to go and the drive-through times that they wanted us to hit. And my mentor in the labor movement often says, especially when we were organizing Starbucks, the only difference between why a factory worker, why it's normal that we think of them as skilled labor, and the fact that they're able to afford, a middle-class lifestyle, although that's quickly going away. And the difference between a barista is that one organized in the 1930s and one didn't. And, I'm sure there's differences between multi-billion-dollar corporations like Starbucks and your average mom and pop restaurant. And I understand that and understand the cost differential. But I think that's, again, a broader conversation about the policies. It's not just about the tip worker, the tip tax. It's about, why are billionaires the ones that are getting the massive tax buyouts from this, new administration? Why are companies allowed to price gouge like in the pandemic, when we were seeing all these prices for foods increase, and we were wondering, why is this happening? And it's that, companies can just get away with doing that. So I think, to the point about how do we solve this, this is a huge question about the policies that are not just at the state level, but are happening at the federal level too. And workers having a voice on the job, having better rights to unionize, I think, is a massive part of fixing that, because right now we're down to 6% unionization rate in the private sector in this country. And you can look at the graph. It shows as unionization rate goes down, income equality becomes a lot bigger. So that's another huge piece of the puzzle, which I know we don't have time to get into really in an hour segment.
We're going to take our first
I
call.
think what you're hearing,
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
I was just going to say, I think what you're hearing from everybody is affordability, right? I mean, that is sort of the biggest problem right now, cutting across all lines here of each of us on the call, whether it's business or it's workers. I mean, affordability has become the challenge that we can't overcome right now. In terms of the employees, they've done an excellent job articulating what the challenges are in terms of childcare and housing and healthcare charges that they're struggling to deal with. And in the restaurant side, we've struggled since the pandemic to come back and deal with the cost of goods, and the prices in the restaurants have risen, accordingly. Everyone has seen it, and it's made it more challenging for us to run our small businesses and our restaurants across the state and across the country. So it's really about affordability right now.
We're going to take our first call of the hour from Tom in Irondequoit. Tom,
Yes.
go ahead.
Hello. Yes. I had my friend who passed away, worked all his life as a waiter and made very, very good money between here and Florida, upscale restaurants. And he never reported his cash tips. So when he retired, he told me he received the minimum, which I think is around $600 Social Security benefit. I wonder if that was covered on people not recording their tips. I mean, they're only hurting themselves when they retire. Thank you. I'll hang up and.
So the no tax on tip legislation moving through either the reconciliation bill in the House or the Senate version that passed as a standalone. This is wrapped up into that one big, beautiful bill in the House. That actually is going to only apply to income tax and not FICA tax. And FICA tax is where Social Security and Medicaid come in. So that's important that people can continue to pay into and then get did I say Medicaid or Medicare? Medicare Social Security benefit. So if you don't pay into that system, you can't get out of that system. So that's one of the things that we're making sure as representatives of the restaurant industry that it gets included in that legislation, because if we stop paying into that, then things like Social Security and unemployment benefits would be impacted. So not FICA taxes on payroll, but income tax only, just to clarify.
We're going to take our first break of the hour, and we'll come back. We'll be talking more on tax on tips.
Support for your public radio station comes from our members and from the Highlands at Pittsford, an independent and assisted living community affiliated with the University of Rochester, offering cottage and apartment homes, daily life enrichment activities, and care assistance as needed. More at highlandsatpittsford.org.
Your tips, unless you're trying to get a mortgage.
And we're back on Connections. I'm Gino Finelli, filling in for Evan Dawson. We are talking on the No Tax on Tips Act. And for Ken in particular, I wanted to play a quick clip from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on how the tax deduction will actually be paid for. This was the plan that the federal administration has. So I think we have that clip that we can play here.
The president campaigned on no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime, and the restoring interest deductibility for autos, for American-made autos. So tariff income could be used for tax relief on all of those immediately.
So the argument he's making there is that tariffs will be able to pay for all these different tax deductions and tax.
So let's take
removals,
two bad policies and roll them all into one.
That's
big
why I want to
ugly
get your thoughts on it.
One big ugly bill. That's right. There we are. I mean, I could go on at length, but I think many people have heard those arguments. The whole tariff thing is just a big can of worms, and it's complicated. And the administration is going at it in a purely bizarre fashion.
So let's talk about that. I mean, this is not limited to service workers. I think everyone, whatever industry you're in, save for some very, very lucky people out there, are feeling some kind of economic squeeze. And the wage gap in this country has widened. And we are in a position where the core question that we have to kind of address, I think, is how do we make sure that every American has access to a sustainable living, a good living? And we're in the context of talking about the service industry here, but again, it's not limited to just that. But Casey, I want to turn to you to start on this. This seems like a tiny little step that has a lot of bipartisan support. It has a lot of people talking about it. It seems to be attractive to voters, but from the conversation we're having, it sounds like it doesn't really actually do much to address the core problem. What do you think would? What does benefit the average worker and can help them, just have a stable, good living from their employer?
Oh, wow. You gave me a big one. Where do I even begin? I mean, I kind of already addressed this, but, from my camp, it's having a union. It's for those of you who have gone through a union organization process, it's insanely, incredibly difficult to do. And companies have outsized power. The National Labor Relations Board, which is also under attack
Support for your
by Trump, it was already a weak institution, is an even more weak institution these days. And having a union is about having an equal voice in a company. And so, again, I'm thinking about companies like Amazon, companies like Starbucks, like Microsoft, these huge corporations that make billions of dollars, where they do have low-wage workers. I think I saw this statistic where it was something like the CEO of Starbucks, only has to work an hour of his time to make what an average barista makes in an entire year. That's the kind of inequality that we're living in. And so if you look at policies that I think I would support, you have the PRO Act, which would help workers be able to organize a lot easier. You have Medicaid for all, which would help with healthcare costs, because having your healthcare tied to your employer is another, wormhole that we could delve into that makes it, alters the power dynamic a lot in the workplace. There's ideas of universal base income that's, a little bit more out there, but there's lots of policies out there that would actually address and make a huge difference in the lives of working people. And in my opinion, this is not one of them.
Maria, what about you? I mean, what benefits the average service worker? What actually would help policy-wise?
I think I've mentioned it a couple of times, just access to healthcare. And I think you just mentioned having carpal tunnel. And I went to my doctor to talk about my carpal tunnel, and I had trigger thumb from shaking tins. And his response was, well, stop. I'm like, oh, cool, but I have to pay my mortgage. I can't just stop. So just having those sort of safety nets too tipped employees have both a very physically taxing, if you say no tax, there's still taxes on our physical health and our mental health too. So supports around that too are very important for sure.
Melissa, on the restaurant end, when you talk to restaurant owners that are trying to support a staff that in a pretty razor's edge kind of margin industry, I mean, what helps? What could help? What burden or regulation or policy could help to give the industry a little bit more breathing room to support workers and give the workers their living wages?
Well, one of the things we're trying to push for this year, and we're quickly running out of time with the New York State legislative session, but swipe fees on credit cards have risen in cost to the restaurant. It's now the third or fourth largest expense to a restaurant, behind labor and food cost, sometimes rent, depending on where in the state you are and whether or not you own your location. So what we're talking about with swipe fees is we're getting charged that 3-4% on credit card swipe fees on sales tax and on tips. So that's coming out of the restaurant's pocket when they remit that money to the tipped employee, or they remit that money to the state for sales tax. And we think that that should be changed. And surprisingly, what we're hearing is that could average out to about $8,000 a year for a small business. And we think it's really important, and we have a coalition of other small business owners, not just restaurants, that would be impacted on the sales tax side. So that's something that we think would not cost the state government money, would not impact negatively any of the employees or the guests, but would be positive for the restaurant and be able to keep some of those dollars in our pocket for the restaurant owner to hopefully keep building out their restaurant and get through some really difficult economic times.
Ken, I want to turn to you a little bit on this. I mean, do you see any policy positions that can help us?
Well, I'm going to make things more difficult by throwing in some challenges here. When we talk about unionization, we talk about the power dynamic between owners and workers. It has always been true, particularly so, prominently so in the last 30, 40 years, that the advent of labor-saving technology has put a tremendous amount of pressure on the labor movement, which is one of the reasons why the labor movement has been shrinking. And in this sector as well, I mean, one of the fastest growing segment in the food away from homes category is fast casual. Fast casual like Panera, where you can order from a kiosk, and the amount of labor. There's no table service. The amount of labor required to run a fast casual restaurant is far less. The amount of training required for the people who are working in the fast casual business is lower. And so that puts some pressure on, I think, on the attempt to unionize workers in that particular sector. And we're going to continue to see that impact of technology. I mean, we're all tired of talking about AI, but there's no question but that AI moves that technological pressure on labor into new industries, into new sectors entirely. And into yours, Gino. I mean, the impact of
you're right. Yes,
technology on journalism is astonishing. One of the founders of the Rochester Beacon, and we even at our very small size, we struggle to figure out how that affects it. I'm the opinion editor, and I get submissions that I read, and I say, darn, this thing's been written by an AI. So am I actually going to pay someone a small stipend? We don't pay much, but small stipend for cranking up an AI and sending me this, apparently superficially literate essay on an important public issue. Those problems are I'm afraid only going to get more significant over the next 20 years.
Yeah,
or two.
Well,
you talk to.
You look at my industry, absolutely. You look at any TV news website article, that's all formatted by AI now, and we don't do that here, and never will. Anyone who tries to is going to have to fight me. But in the service industry, you can look at how, especially larger industries, have replaced low-level workers with automation, self-checkout lines, and self-checkout lines have gotten very efficient over the years. They know it's in your hands before you even scan it. It's only reasonable to think that as soon as the opportunity presents itself, probably to the larger players in the restaurant industry, if they can replace someone with an automation or AI or some kind of new technology tool, they will. A bartender might be difficult. A server might be difficult. But there are ways to do things that typically would be worked by a low-level worker. Maria, I would like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the most important thing for us is the human connection. And no, I didn't mean to click into the name of the show, but I think that's our relationships that we foster in all of our work is the most important part, and the humanity that we bring to it. And you knew that article was written by AI because it lacked humanity. I know
unfortunately
in my
it wasn't
students-
far off what a lot of people submit that I know is written by themselves.
I know when my
that's
students
the challenge.
submit
it's getting
an
better
essay
and better and better.
that ChatGPT wrote, it lacks their humanity and
Yeah,
connection. If I'm looking for a fast bite, maybe I'll go to Panera, but chances are I'm looking for not only something delicious, I want that human connection, and you can't replace that with a robot.
I agree with that, but the question is the share of the customers that are looking for the human connection.
I think that's why my guests come in. They
do,
love to see us, and we love to see them. And
I'm sure that's true, and I think that's and there will always be a place where that human connection is highly valued. Unfortunately, you're struggling with an industry where a lot of people are looking simply to get in and out and get in and out fast. So
Sure.
it's tough. It's just a tough place to be.
I want to build on that a little bit. And Maria, just tell us why you entered the industry and why you stay in it. It seems like it is a tough and sometimes physically taxing job. So.
Yeah, I feel like I've been in this. I think the way that I love is seeing full bellies, and I come from a Eastern European background, and hospitality has always been really important. And I love that I can be creative and what's different, I've also been a teacher all my life, I think, too. And the thing about working in the food service industry is that it's not such a long-term investment as teaching is. My seniors will graduate, and I may not see them for decades, right? But I know immediately how you feel about that cocktail that I just poured for you. And just shameless plug really quick, it is Rochester Cocktail Revival Week. And so there's lots of great experiences around town, and feel free to go and tip extra. Speaking of tips, but anyway, and that's part of it too. In the restaurants, I'm not just slinging beers and pasta. I'm making connections and developing these relationships with my guests too, and understanding what they enjoy. And I want to bring them that joy because, as corny as it sounds, it brings me joy. And it also, I can afford working at a different kind of school that gives me some extra family time, not necessarily in the public school system. And I could afford being with my babies when they were young too, because I'd work in the evening, so I could be with them at night. So I think that the restaurant industry is a very vulnerable and forgiving place that focuses on fulfilling these human needs of, food and sustenance, but also our emotional needs for humanity too.
And Casey, you had mentioned how just difficult the work at Starbucks was.
So hard.
Yeah, and I think there is an impression that a lot of people have that a lot of service industry jobs are for kids, people right out of high school sometimes, low-level workers, unskilled workers. And I was wondering if you could just respond to that idea. This is a common refrain of whether you think that's true or not.
I think it's so far from the truth. I would say to those people, okay, I'd like to see you,
Exactly.
make 50 lattes during rush hour at Starbucks at 7 in the morning when you're responsible for doing 10 different tasks. And also the idea about service, it's a high school job. Okay, does Starbucks close from the hours of 7 to 3 while everybody's in high school? No, of course not. There's people that I have friends that have worked at Starbucks for decades, and they love working there. A lot of people do, as Maria was saying, genuinely enjoy their jobs, but it's often just not a sustainable job, whether the physical toll it takes on people, lack of healthcare, or some of these other things that are just necessary. So I think the way our society looks at service workers, I think it is changing, though. I have this one very short story I'll share where, when I was first organizing at Starbucks, everybody kind of said that same refrain, like, if you want a union, if you want a real job, then go, get education, go, work in an office or whatever. And then, about a year and a half later, we were having a picket line at a different employer, also service industry. And somebody, I kid you not, yelled out the window, if you want a union, go work at Starbucks. And so, a year and a half ago, I was told that Starbucks workers didn't deserve a union. So I think it is a lot about just how we view these jobs. And in my opinion, there's no such thing as unskilled labor. All labor is skilled, and it's just what, it's a change in mindset that we have to embark on to change those expectations.
So, Melissa, I want to turn to you on this too. I mean, what kind of person, from your experience, is the kind that is attracted to the service industry and is, there for the long haul, that are doing that kind of work and are doing it day in, day out, and are committed to it? How would you describe a person like that from your experience?
I would say that you meet a lot of people. So those people who are very outgoing, very friendly, love talking to people and meeting new people. They're usually very energetic, love the flexibility of the industry. That's something you have to embrace. You have to embrace that you can work different shifts, but you're also going to work weekends. You're going to work holidays. You're going to work times when your family and friends have time off. But, you love it and you have a passion for it. And I couldn't agree more with Maria and Casey on, raising the bar on the professionalism of this industry. It is hard work, and it should be viewed as professional a job as anything else out there. So, I think that's what you find, is that you find people with a real passion, either for feeding people or seeing people, depending on whether or not, they're cooking for them or they're serving them. But it's all about pleasing the guests as they walk through that door and putting a smile on their face.
Can I ask a clarification question?
Mm-hmm.
Does this bill include other types of service like hair and spa services?
It does, yeah. And that's why Nevada was so, their senators were so hot on it, is because of casino workers.
Okay.
So there is, it's pretty much, it's anyone who receives a tip.
Yeah.
Melissa, that sounds like a worker who deserves health care. I appreciate you all being here. Ken Garner, economist. Maria, thank you so much for being here. This was great. Casey with Workers United, and Melissa with the New York State Restaurant Association. A lot of people here today. Thank you both for being here so much.
Thank you, everybody.
This program is a production of WXXI Public Radio. The views expressed do not necessarily represent those of this station, its staff, management, or underwriters. The broadcast is meant for the private use of our audience. Any rebroadcast or use in another medium without expressed written consent of WXXI is strictly prohibited. Connections with Evan Dawson is available as a podcast. Just click on the Connections link at WXXInews.org.